The Old City Cemetery of Sacramento is the sprawling resting place of California pioneers. Join Jeff on this episode of History Hunters as he hunts down the graves of remarkable Californians, including Indian fighters, a Donner Party survivor, a wealthy man who financed the Transcontinental Railroad, and 3 state governors.
Today we're going to check out the historic Sacramento City Cemetery right over there. The first grave that I noticed as I pulled my car up here, back there, you see that tombstone behind me is Newton Booth. He was the governor of California. What strikes me about this cemetery is the ornate quality and style of the tombstones. You just don't see that unless you're in an older cemetery. This explains how the cemetery was established in 1849, which coincides right with the gold rush. That's what Newton Booth looked like. And he's buried right over here. As you can see, he was born in 1825 and died in 1892. It looks like the entire family's here. It states up there that he was governor of California in 1871. He was a U.S. Senator in 1873. He came out to California in 1850, right after the gold rush, at the age of 25, and he became a successful grocer here in Sacramento. And in 1871, he became governor of California, and he served 4 years till 1875. These are members of the Crocker family, a very famous family here in California that helped establish the railroad that linked the West and the East. They're investors in that, and also affiliated with Crocker Bank. I think I read that there's at least 40 to 60 acres here of just some amazing markers. Very historical cemetery. There's even somebody who survived the Donner Party who's buried here. We're going to try to find her grave as well. Cemeteries may be kind of morbid places, like my son says they're really morbid, but if you think about it, this is the ultimate end of history, because these are people who made history and they're buried here. This cemetery was established in 1849 when Sacramento founder John Sutter donated 10 acres to the city for this purpose. So the grounds were landscaped in the Victorian garden style popular at the time. But curiously, in 1850, Sacramento was swept by a cholera epidemic. Cholera is just a nasty way to die. It's often called Blue Death, and it's caused by a bacterial infection that's quickly spread, partly because people don't wash their hands and they aren't sanitary. Cholera entered the city by way of one of the steamers when some of the immigrants were coming in, and somebody was infected with it. It quickly spread. A number of doctors actually died treating the patients. It's not a pretty death, because we're talking about cramping, diarrhea, loss of body fluids, just a slow, painful way to die. They're buried in a mass grave, and legend has it that some of the victims are actually buried out there under the road when the road wasn't there. This indicates that there's an unmarked burial spot, over 3,000 pioneers who were buried somewhere between the north border of Broadway and the northern portion of the cemetery, and between 9th and 11th Street. So that would place them out here. There's actually bodies out here underneath the road. Crazy. This memorial right here is dedicated to the 17 doctors who died while caring for victims of the 1850 cholera epidemic. And there's all their names. Here lies Hardin Bigelow, who was the first elected mayor of Sacramento. 1850, he was also shot in what's known as the Squatters' Riot. John Sutter owned a lot of property around here, and there were a lot of people coming out west. They just took his land. There were a lot of legal fights over it. in August of 1850. Now, it was probably hot back then, but there was a huge riot that was happening, and Mayor Bigler went down there to help intervene and help restore law and order. He was on Sutter's side. It was just a very tumultuous time in California history. He's buried right here. And somebody left some money on his grave. I'm not sure what the significance of that is. Here lies John Sutter Jr. He was the son of John Sutter, the one who is known for establishing a fort and owning a lot of land around here. So that wooden headboard back there is one of the few remaining from the period. You know, back in the day, there were like thousands of these wooden headboards because they were cheap. They were an inexpensive alternative to the granite and marble that was used around here. At least the rich people got to use them. The poor people had to buy those. And as you can tell, this is from 1876 and it hasn't survived. We don't know whose name is written on it. So, Edwin Bryant Crocker died in 1875. He was one of the richest people in California, as you can tell by the expense of this gravesite. After he passed, his widow donated all of his art collection to the city of Sacramento, and it's now the Crocker Art Gallery. At one time, he was a Supreme Court justice here in California, and he helped get the Central Pacific Railroad established back in the 1870s. Edwin is here. Wife Margaret. This is the burial place of Amy Crocker Corin, who was the child. Amy is one of the more controversial figures. She was considered a hellcat, just this wild child. She had 5 marriages. She engaged in seances, and they say that the sailors who came in on the steamers here in Sacramento taught her how to cuss. She was quite a character. And there's a story about her being in love with this snake, and I don't know if I want to go into detail about that, but okay. I've never seen such an ornate collection of granite and marble headstones. This is ridiculous. I mean, look at the size of that thing. If you knew what they lived in, it wouldn't surprise you that they had to have the biggest tombstone here in the cemetery. Mark Hopkins, he was considered one of the big four, one of the investors for the Central Pacific Railroad. When they wanted to bring the railroad from the east to the west, and they met in Utah, this man's money helped do it. Hopkins and his wife lived in a mansion so big that it wasn't completed before his death, and it was atop Nob Hill in San Francisco. Work on the Hopkins mansion started in 1875, but Mark was in bad health and he never got to see his house finished there on Nob Hill, and he passed away 3 years later on the railroad near Yuma, Arizona. Their house was eventually completed, but in 1906, the San Francisco earthquake wiped it out. In 1926, built in its place is the Mark Hopkins Hotel. Mark Hopkins' remains are in that tomb right there. There are about 900,000 pounds of stone back there quarried from different places. One of the places is at the top of the Sierras that was blasted away by the Central Pacific Railroad. Mr. Hopkins admired that stone and he wanted to include that in his tombstone here, which was sized for 16 members of his family. His brother's on the other side, and his nephew Samuel is also here. He died at sea on the way home from the Orient. Typically when you died at sea, you were dumped into the ocean at sea and buried at sea. Let's go up here and see. It says that Samuel Hopkins died at sea on the way to Japan, October 28th, 1876. And it looks like he was 33 years old, if I can make that out correctly. There is a bolt holding that entire slab in place, and behind that is a body. Within Mr. Hopkins' grave is this rather unusual memorial here to Alfred Hart. And it has these unusual glasses in it, and I found out that it was in memory of a guy who helped photograph in 3D stereo the thousands of men rushing to build the Central Pacific Railroad from Sacramento to Promontory Point, Utah. And right down here is one of his stereographic photographs. It says A.A. Hart. And this was shot on the trestle to the American River Bridge near 30th Street. These unusual 3D lenses, they're just for decoration. But anyway, the curious thing is that he died in poverty and his body was sold to a medical school. So I'm not even sure if he's actually buried here. There's these lines. And then on this side, an actual photograph of the camera that he used. We've got to talk about this monument behind me. It's the tallest here in the cemetery. It belongs to Albert Maver Wynn. He was elected to the first city council of Sacramento in 1849 after, the gold rush, and he became mayor by a vote of the council. In 1875, he founded the Native Sons of the Golden West. Right down here we have a bear, which is the official animal of the state of California. And talks about him being a general, and there his picture is up there. NSGW stands for Native Sons of the Golden West. Over here we have the Great Seal of the state of California. There's a fascinating grave over here I just have to show you. As you can tell here, it says William Stephen Hamilton, son of Alexander Hamilton. That is the Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill. Young William was only 6 years old when his father was killed in that ridiculous duel with Aaron Burr. Killed one of our founding fathers. First Secretary of the Treasury. Young William came out to California in 1849, like a lot of people, in search of riches. He died a year later, but he absolutely hated this area. He said that he would rather be hung in lead mines back east than spend time out here in this miserable part of the country. Sacramento could get very hot in the summertime, and he died in August. The family wanted William to be buried here with the image of his father because he was the honorable member of the family. I guess young William was just not cutting the mustard. As a tragic note, the cholera outbreak in 1850 is what took young William's life. John Bigler is one of the more interesting characters in California politics. He came out west in 1850. When word of the gold rush reached back east in mid-1848, where he was practicing law, he decided to come out to California. Instead of finding gold, he wanted to find some law positions, and he found out that there were none available. So he worked a number of odd jobs, including working the docks. But he got into the dirtiest work of all, which is politics. He worked his way up from California State Assembly as a Democrat and became a speaker. Interestingly, when cholera hit Sacramento in 1850, Bigler actually contracted it, but he survived. He was elected governor in 1852, and his interests included protecting the mining companies that were prevalent in California. Governor Bigler shared in the anti-Chinese sentiment back in the 1850s. He said that they wouldn't assimilate into American culture and that their willingness to work was causing an Asiatic immigration tide that needed to be stemmed. So he decided to place a tax that if it wasn't paid within a couple of days, they would be turned around. And that tax was like $50. It was a pretty severe tax. Governor Bigler was honored with the naming of Lake Tahoe before it was named Lake Tahoe. The name was taken off when he decided that he was going to side with the Confederate states during the Civil War. In 1854, Bigler pushed for Sacramento to be named the state capital of California from Benicia. Because he sided with the South, was known for extravagant spending in the state, and because of his anti-Chinese immigration policy, Bigler was turned out of office in 1855, becoming the first governor of California to lose an election. I am told that this granite from his marker here was mined out of Indian diggings in El Dorado County. And as you can see, it is starting to age. But then again, it's been here since 1871. This is what they call the state section of the cemetery because there's a number of officials here. Like Governor of California in front of me, William Irwin. He's got a huge marker, like made out of marble. You can see he was born in 27 and died in 1886. This man here, Edward Colgan, was the state controller at one time. Here's Levi Ratcliffe, who was a state treasurer, died in 1898. Edwin C. Waite, Secretary of State, died in 1894. Here's another Secretary of State, W.H. Weeks. Oh man, he died in 1863. Here's a monument to Hugh Murray, Chief Justice of the California State Supreme Court. Born out of state, St. Louis. Died in 1857. This is one of the older graves here. Here's a marker for W.I. Ferguson, native of Washington County, Pennsylvania. Died in 1858, 33 years old. Looks like he was a state senator. But let me show you this. It's kind of a bust of him. And here we have the grave of Benjamin B. Redding. He was mayor of Sacramento. He was a state assemblyman, became Secretary of State. For his service, they honored him by naming him the town of Redding up in Northern California. How did that come about? Well, Redding was a land agent for the Central Pacific Railroad. And when that railroad reached Shasta County in 1872, a town cropped up and they needed to name it. And they chose the name of Redding. This is the reason for the name of Redding, California. General George Wright and his wife died July 30th, 1865. Died together, lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death, they were not divided. Wow. Very tall. This details how General George Wright, 1803 to 1865, he was a graduate of West Point, and he was gallant on the field, unwavering loyalty to the Union that prompted President Lincoln to appoint him commander of the Pacific Coast during the Civil War. Sinking of the steamer Brother Jonathan off the coast of Crescent City during a violent storm claimed the general as a victim July 30th, 1865. What this doesn't tell you is that his body was lost at sea for 6 weeks, and then it was finally recovered. It probably washed up on the shores there in Crescent City. Then they brought him here to be buried. Fort George Wright out of Spokane, Washington is named after this man here. So there's a lot of people that might think that this man, Colonel Thomas F. Wright, the United States Army, who was killed in the Modoc Wars, got what was coming to him. Thomas Wright was one of the people in the Army who was trying to round up the Modoc Indians and get them to leave. He was slaughtered with a number of his other men. They were slaughtered up in the lava bed area where there's a national monument now. The Indians had the advantage on them, a tactical advantage, attacked the Army, and Mr. Wright was killed along with several of his men. The Indians stripped the bodies of their clothing and left them naked. When their comrades arrived at the battlefield, it was night, so they didn't realize how bad the things were. And then when morning came, they saw a massive slaughter of men. I think it was in excess of 43. 43 years old. This is an amazing cemetery if you got a couple hours to spend here. If hanging out in cemeteries is your thing. This sign indicates that New Helvetia was the settlement for John Sutter over at Sutter's Fort, a different part of Sacramento. That early burial place was neglected, it was flooded, so they decided to move them to a different location in a park called New Helvetia Cemetery. In 1956, the city decided to build a school on the premises, which meant that those graves, about 5,000 graves, had to be exhumed. Well, apparently 400 of those graves are buried in this section here called the New Helvetia Cemetery. And right over here is a fascinating grave. This is the grave of Philippine Kesselberg, who was a native of Germany and a survivor of the Donner Party, 1846. I was told that Mr. Kesselberg was really a terrible guy. He liked to beat animals, he was mean to his wife, and nobody on the Donner Party liked him. He caused a lot of problems on that trip. Mrs. Kesselberg didn't like to talk about her experiences there, eating the bodies of the dead. It was one of the worst snowstorms in California history, and they were stuck in the middle of it with no way out, no food. So a lot of them perished. Some of them were rescued, including Mrs. Kesselberg here. Mrs. Kesselberg passed away, leaving Mr. Kesselberg with the care of all of his children with special needs. On April 11th, 1865, a Sacramento woman decided to celebrate the surrender of the South by flying the American flag for the first time over the state capitol. She snuck across the street from where she lived, crawled up a ladder during the construction while the men were out having lunch, and she hoisted up the American flag. And the story is that she nailed the American flag to the highest point that she could reach in the state capitol. Her identity was kept a secret, but she left a note explaining that, "Gentlemen, I've had the pleasure of climbing the ladder and placing the stars and stripes. 3 cheers for Uncle Abe and Cabinet, a poor but patriotic woman, signed a lady." And apparently her identity was not made known until 1929, when her daughter told a newspaper that it was her mother that did that. It was a celebrated story here in Sacramento. This is the grave of Jane, the woman who hoisted the American flag in the state capitol for the first time. Jane Norris died in 1899 at the age of 57. Sorry, 67. That tombstone's quite worn down. I think that's a pretty cool story. The story is that she did that in her nightgown. I don't know how true that is. Well, if you've made it to the end of this program, I appreciate the fact that you like history as much as I do, and don't mind going to cemeteries once in a while to learn a little bit about our past. California has a great and rich past, and sometimes the only way that you can dig into it is by visiting a cemetery and learning the stories about the people who are buried here. We would love to have you subscribe to this channel. Just click on the button below.